Why self-portraits are terrifying.
This is the final self-portrait of Pablo Picasso, fittingly titled Self-Portrait Facing Death. It was created less than a year before he passed away at 91. It took several months to complete and had multiple iterations, but the final piece was
multiple iterations? I mean, this just looks like a scribble, dude, from somebody that's, like, slowly deteriorating mentally.
Of anxiety and dread. His friend, Pierre Dax, was one of the few people to provide commentary for the portrait. When he said, Picasso held the drawing beside his face to show the expression of fear was a contrivance. He later visited again and noticed that this time, the lines in the portrait had gotten deeper and darker, a change that also reflected Picasso's mind state. He did not blink. I had the sudden impression that he was staring his own death in the face, like a good Spaniard. A few months later, Picasso would pass away, and this was one of his most talked about pieces. And
I think that it's, if any other random old person made this painting to resemble their death, it's just a stupid scribble. Am I wrong? I think it has meaning because it's Picasso, and it's showing that, like, you know, with all the amazing art that he's made in his final moments, he's basically just drawing, like, a very weird, creepy image of an unblinking figure.
Iconic artist's interpretation of his own demise and a final self-portrait to encapsulate the angst and existentialism that comes along with it. That's just an introduction of what I wanted to show you today, because in this video I want to talk about the concept of the final portrait.
The weirdest one that I've ever heard of is, have you seen the one of the guy that was like a very known realism artist, and he drew himself when he got diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and he would draw himself every single time, and he could show it. I don't know if they're going to cover it. I would assume so, because it's like one of the most famous fucking cases of that. But he would paint himself, and every day as it would go on, not every day, but, like, you know, he would wait time, and he, like, eventually couldn't even remember who he was.
Dark, strange, and disturbing world of an artist's last time creating a piece that is a direct reflection of themselves. It has happened time and time again, and they're almost always different. Some of them show the mind deteriorating. Some of them show their bodies given up, and you might even see a glimmer of hope or a curiosity for what's on the other side. It's an incredibly specific type of art, but it's one that I think should be explored. So today I'm going to show you a few examples of the final self-portrait and the disturbing world around it. William Utermohlen was an American artist who came to prominence in the 1960s and 70s because of his figurative art. He created pieces that were reflections of the world around him, realistic paintings that were defined and to the point. Occasionally he dabbled in other styles of art, but this is what he was most known for. He also created many self-portraits throughout his life. This is one that he created
it's this guy. Oh my god, it is this guy. Wait, this is the one that I'm actually talking about.
1967, when he was 33 years of age. William began to suffer memory loss in 1991, and his work began to reflect that. He created a series of paintings called the Conversation Paintings, which are said to be his attempt to remember the life he had before he was diagnosed. In 1995, he was told that he had early onset Alzheimer's disease, and that it might only be a matter of time before his mind was completely gone. That sparked a new series of paintings that would go on to be some of William's best known work, a series of self-portraits that would be created while he had developing Alzheimer's. Although there are quite a few of these pieces, there are 5 that are especially known. The first one is from 1996. This portrait is fairly true to William's style, and it's consistent with the works we have seen previously. A year later, he created this. Again, it doesn't seem to be terribly far off. William has seemingly aged quite a bit here, at least by his own self-reflection. In 1998, things had clearly changed, and we can see this through his self-portrait that he created that year. We see a face of anguish.
Oh my god. It's like he can't even remember who he is, though. How does Alzheimer's work? It's basically just an effective long-term and short-term memory loss. When people get Alzheimer's, their brain starts deteriorating functionally to where you start forgetting things. And long ago things are easy to remember, right? So if you have a grandpa or grandma that has Alzheimer's, if you ask them about their childhood, they'll likely be able to go in very acute detail of what they experienced. But the more recent things become, the harder it is for them to talk about them and explain what happened because they can't remember. It gets worse and worse to where they forget their grandkids. Then they forget their kids. Then they forget themselves. And then I think it actually gets biologically so bad to where their body even forgets how to functionally breathe and they effectively suffocate. Am I wrong? That's like worst case. That's like if it really ends. Alzheimer's. I think that's how it ends. Alzheimer's disease, how do they die of it? Loss of brain function causes dehydration, poor nutrition, infection. Yeah. As diseases like Alzheimer's progress, they damage you more and more in your brain. This damage eventually affects areas of the brain that control the body, causing systems to go wrong, shut down, and eventually lead to death. Yeah. So, like, it starts with just, like, base memory, like, social-based stuff that's not really affecting your functional body, and then it gets so bad that you physically just can't do bodily processes. That's, like, my fucking biggest fear, dude, is getting Alzheimer's. Getting dementia. I've said it. It's just forgetting who you are, and I've said this before. Dude, that's, like, one of the biggest things they talk about in like Roman Stoic philosophy is the idea that once your brain starts going and you recognize that you are either physically or mentally deteriorating to where you will no longer be you in a short amount of time, that is the only time Stoics would deem it, not only time, but that's a time where Stoics deem it as acceptable to kill yourself. And actually what you should do. I'm not saying I agree with that, but it's not even from a depressive standpoint. It's that you're preventing yourself from effectively deteriorating so far gone to a level where you're so far gone that you're not even you. It's like the worst thing. I think Alzheimer's is one of the worst things that people can experience themselves and also their family members around them. Because even from an outward perspective, say your grandma gets Alzheimer's. At some point, they won't know who you are. They'll forget you. Even though they watched you be born. They watched you grow up. They watched you graduate high school. At some point, you could walk up to them and they'll be like, who are you? And they'll do it to their own kids.
Unconnected to a body, staring at us bleakly. It's obvious that things have taken its toll and there are 2 more pieces to look at. Unfortunately, they do not get better. This was the painting we saw in 1999. Instead of a bleak expression, we see no expression, an image that can barely be described as a face at all. There are some minor attempts made to create a background and some semblance of color.
And I'm assuming as he developed later and later into Alzheimer's disease, whoever was with him had to get him to do these self-portraits. Because he probably even forgot that he was doing
A year later, we see the final piece, and all of that goes away as well. This is what we are left with. The final self-portrait that William has created, and his last attempt at creating anything in the world of art. A creator who was expressive, detailed, and able to accurately reflect the things around him, has now been stripped of all of that, and this image is the clearest example of that. It's amazing that William even had the foresight to do this and see it through. This is arguably his most famous series of creations, and it came—
It's so crazy how rapidly it declines, too. Look at that. The first one is so fucking detailed. Like, to a T, that looks like him. And then this one's just like, a good, like somebody in Art 1 in high school could probably make something around this level. And then it just gets so fucking bad.
Most famous series of creations, and it came from such a terrible place. But being the artist that he was able to turn it into something with an immense amount of meaning that would be talked about for years to come. William faded into obscurity after this to deal with his illness, which rapidly got worse. In 2007, he passed away from pneumonia at a nursing home in West London. But many people around him said that the real William was gone well before that. And
yeah, I mean, that's what I'm saying. It's like, at what point does that person leave? And that's what they write about. Like, dude, there's a lot of fucking philosophy that writes about that shit, where if your brain, and even non-dementia related, if you get so old, at what point do you cease to exist? Because the people, me right now, and you guys watching me, even if we don't die physically within 10 years, the us that exists now will be dead in 10 years. And that's why I was talking about this when we were watching the video about the scariest monster. I don't know if it's comforting, but it's cool to think about when you die, the only part you that exists right now will not have to deal with the fear of death. And obviously the fear of death, but you will not have to deal with dying. The you that exists whenever you are, on death's doorstep will be the one that has to deal with it. If you don't get hit by a car or fucking, something where you just immediately randomly die. I'm talking like a slow progression of death.
Brian Charnley was an English artist born in 1949 who attended the Central School of Arts in London, but was forced to drop out early when he was diagnosed with acute schizophrenia. This diagnosis greatly shaped his style, and he used his art to express the hardships, confusion, and mental anguish that came along with having paranoid schizophrenia. In his later years, Brian was getting frustrated with the lack of success that his art brought him, and believed it was because he was too heavily medicated to the point that it stopped any chance he had of making headway in the world of art. He decided to lower the dosage of medication that he would take. He also decided to create a series of self-portraits while he did this, and document the process through his art. This has become his most famous series of paintings by far, but unfortunately it does not have a happy ending. Still, let's look at some of the paintings in question and see what Brian was creating. There are 17 portraits on his website, and he wrote about each one in his diary, which is also on his site. I will be going through a handful of these portraits to give you an idea of how they evolved, but if you want to read about each one, I'll leave the site linked below, as well as a video from Blind Dweller who talks about each portrait in more detail. This is the first painting we see from Brian after he cut down on his medication, made on the 20th of April 1991. The portrait is a clear example of Brian dealing with some sensory overload. His paranoia had increased a great deal and he was hearing things all the time, hence the rabbit ear. After this, Brian created a few pieces that contained less facial features and were more abstract. It wasn't until the 6th of May 1991 that he created this piece, a sort of return to form for Brian. The self-portrait was much clearer, but the imagery was still concerning. The journal entry he wrote was also a scattered...
I can't wrap my head around schizophrenia. I know what it is. I know what it does to people. But it's something that, it's one of those things where you can't experience it, so you can't fully understand it. The idea of having schizophrenia and dealing with just seeing or hearing basically falsified things. And then also just the paranoia that comes along with that. And the lack of recognition of faces and stuff like that.
A collection of thoughts with some very strange ramblings.
I've seen so many TikTok accounts. I remember there was this one guy that kept popping up on my For You page. And he was like posting just random cars in parking lots and being like, these people are following me. And he was like paranoid. And all the comments were like, dude, you need to like go to a hospital. Like you need to fucking get help. Like, cause it might've been undiagnosed or he wasn't receiving treatment for it. My mom has it. It's rough to visualize. That's what I'm saying. It's one of those things where it's like, it's not in the same degree, but it's similar to trying to explain sight to a blind person, where you go, well, red is warm and fucking blue is cold. It's like, what the fuck does that mean to somebody that has never seen anything? Have never had, I'm not saying somebody that went blind, somebody that's been blind since birth.
I feel like a target for people's cruel remarks. The people around me cannot understand how I was so stupid and cannot forgive me. Thus, I am a target. The nails in my eyes express that I cannot see, whereas other people seem to have extrasensory perception, and I am blind in this respect. Love hurts. Less than 2 weeks later, on the 18th of May,
wow,
Brian created this, a surreal, significantly darker piece of work. At this stage, Brian had reduced his intake of medication to 1 antidepressant. He was sleeping less, and it was likely that he was beginning to spiral into a deeper depression. Again, this painting shows us a bullseye, but this time, it was in his mouth, a metaphor for his inability to socialize. His brain was replaced by a mouth that he had no control over, a powerful way to express the helplessness of his mental state. In my opinion, this portrait was a real turning point in this series, a metaphorical point of no return. On the 23rd of May, Brian created this, another rare example of him creating a self-portrait that actually looks like him. But as you can see, he has once again replaced his brain with a mouth. He explained it in his journal by writing, "The blue of the portrait is there because I felt depressed through cutting back on the antidepressants. I was pleased that I was able to express such a purely mental concept as thought broadcasting by the simple device of turning the brain into a mouth that I painted it again. One is very much up against the almost impossible task of describing in paint that which is essentially totally invisible. Symbols come to be employed and the appropriate one must be found. Also, it should have a poetic charge attached to it. Yet still, people are too ignorant to see." It's the third time in this series we see Brian replacing his brain with something else, a practice that he developed throughout this series that turned out to be a very effective way to communicate the scrambled thoughts that were happening in his brain. Over a month later, on the 27th of June, Brian believed he was closing in on a painting that could truly express his schizophrenia. This is the painting he made around that time.
Wow. And that makes no fucking sense. What is that? It's like somebody holding a gear shift, smoking and then another face smoking a cigarette, a bunch of mouths around. Is that their brain?
In his journal, he expressed the following: "I am still at an acute disadvantage socially. Can this ever change, or will the anger always remain? I intend to record my progress with more self-portraits to add up when they are all joined together as an important document as to life. At the end of the 20th century, self-portrait will state depth what is to be human and schizophrenic." Unfortunately, we did not get more self-portraits. We did, however, get 2 more paintings in this series. A piece that showed us an array of text that said words like enemy, rival, and past, with the center text reading, "The cards are no good that I'm holding unless they are from another world," which is a lyric from a Bob Dylan song. After this, we got one final painting, a simple enough piece that showed us an array of colors, predominantly red and yellow. There were no journal entries for these 2 paintings, meaning we did not get any further context for the series, and we never will, because unfortunately, these paintings were discovered on the same day that Brian was. He took his own life on the 19th of July, 1991, and these were the last 2 things he ever created. This series is an intense, depressing, and expressive journey which reflected
Brian's fucking sad, man.
In style of art and his mental struggles. It was not only his most popular series of work, but easily the one that connected the most with the people that saw it. He was frustrated and annoyed at his lack of success, and unfortunately, he achieved what
I think that one makes the most sense to me.
And unfortunately, he achieved what he wanted to achieve after he had passed away. He was never able to truly see what his work meant to other people, but that doesn't invalidate it. It's an incredible series of work and a major part of Brian's legacy, even though it did come at a damning price. Francisco Goya was a Spanish painter who was born in the mid-18th century. He was considered to be one of the most important artists of his time. One of his most known pieces of work is a series of prints called Los Caprichos. These prints were packed with expressive imagery that showed the vices and debauchery of Spanish society at the time, which was a relatively consistent theme in his work. His pieces not only criticized society, but also government, war, corruption, and general ignorance. However, even though he was a prolific creator who had strong opinions, there aren't many documented conversations about his thoughts or his worldview, and this is because his personal life was filled with private battles pertaining to his health. In the late 1700s, he went completely deaf because of an illness that wasn't diagnosed in time. This began a series of health scares and illnesses that would plague the rest of his life. It also reflected in his art. Goya's work became slightly more sinister around this time, reflecting a nihilistic worldview that was gradually getting deeper and deeper. Well, when he was 73, he developed a serious illness and it looked like it would be the end of his life. However, a doctor who was a friend of Goya's, named Eugenio Garcia Arrieta, managed to nurse him back to health despite all odds. During this process, Goya was sure he was going to die but would live for another 8 years, and because of this, he created a portrait that showed him and his doctor together. The painting is simply titled Self-Portrait with Dr. Arrieta. But there are other people in the piece. Dark, shadowy figures that loom behind the two of them. This could be
that one's fucking creepy.
His family, a group of spectators, or it could be a reference to the afterlife, the place that Goya was sure he was going. Maybe these people weren't even in the room with them. Maybe Goya just felt their presence and felt as if he was going to be joining
that's what it seems like because of the dark figure
them
around
soon.
them.
It's only speculation, but many art critics have echoed the same idea. It's very obvious that death was on his mind. This is the only self-portrait in this video that includes more than one person, and it's for a very good reason. Although there are at least 5 figures in this painting, Goya might as well be completely alone. His eyes are barely open. He is essentially being held up by his doctor, and his hands are clenched tightly to his bedsheets, almost as if he is trying to clutch on to life itself. Out of all of the artists
I mean, it looks like he wants to die in this, and this guy's fucking keeping him alive.
we have talked about, Goya is in the worst state physically, but his painting is arguably the best quality, and this is because he's the only artist who is painting his physical self deteriorating. His mental side is mostly intact.
Yeah, that's true.
We can see that from the quality of the piece, but he's creating a depiction of a physical illness while everybody else was dealing with a mental one, and that's why I wanted to show you it. The brain is the artist's ultimate tool, and without it they are helpless. That helplessness can produce a new kind of art, a final attempt at recapturing what they once had. It's a depressing,
Yeah, it's like losing, I don't want to say losing your mojo, but it's like when rappers start sucking at rapping or something like that. Like their creative side has fully deteriorated to where they can't even come up with what they want to do, even if it's something as simple as a fucking self-portrait.
nihilistic, gloomy area of art, but it only exists because the artist is still trying, still attempting to create and put something on a canvas that they are proud of. The true sorrow comes afterwards, when the canvas is blank, when there is nothing to draw or paint, when the artist's brain completely deteriorates. That's why these pieces should be looked at in a slightly more hopeful way. They are real, authentic attempts to create something despite the mental anguish the artist is going through. The darkest parts of these battles.
I mean, this one's just fucking terrifying, dude. Like, this is just a blob with a nose and a weird cracked line.
Won't be seen on a canvas.
I wonder if Picasso did Picasso have Alzheimer's, or was it just because he was so old? That was a fucking good ass video though. I really enjoyed that.